Joining us now is Bjorn Lomborg. He is the author of Cool It, The Skeptical Environmentalist's Guide to Global Warming. And Bjorn, I think many of our viewers will know you as the skeptical environmentalist, but for those that don't, at what point did you come to believe that the Al Gores of the world, while well-intentioned, were essentially overdoing it when it came to the evils of climate change?
Well, it really was a long journey, Steve. It started back in 1997. I read an interview by an American economist saying things are getting better with the environment. And my initial reaction was, right-wing American propaganda. I'm an old Greenpeace member, worried, left-wing kind of guy from Denmark. And so we actually set out to disprove him. We thought it was going to be a riot to do so. Turns out that a lot of what he said was right. And that sort of led me to have a conversation of saying climate and environment is important, but we also need to get our facts right. Very often we worry about things that look good or actually look scary on TV, but sometimes that's not the right place to worry. Maybe there are other and more important things to worry about. And that's what I've tried to take on to the climate change debate, which arguably is the biggest discussion right now. What should we be worried about, and how should we deal with climate change?
Do you feel at all concerned that you may be giving comfort to those who are climate change what do we want to call them? Deniers, I guess is what Al Gore calls them, climate change deniers. You concerned about that?
Well, of course, I'm always concerned about people misunderstanding me, but I'm very, very clear in saying I hope I actually both annoy the people who are deniers and the people who are catastrophists. I'm saying climate change is real. It's certainly partly man-made. We are causing it because we put out CO2 burning fossil fuels. So we should not say this is all a hoax or left-wing conspiracy or something. That's just simply not true. Climate change is real. But likewise, we shouldn't go to the other side and say it's an unmitigated catastrophe and it's going to end civilization very soon. Neither of those points are correct. The point is, climate change is a problem, and a problem we need to fix in the 21st century. But we also need to find smart ways to do it, and we're not right now.
Well, let's get into some of that. Obviously, much of the world believes that one of the smartest things we could do is, go Kyoto. A number of countries have adopted the Kyoto Protocol. Canada's one of them. We're certainly not on track to fulfill it. You told Salon.com a month ago, at the end of the day, Kyoto is both impossibly ambitious and environmentally inconsequential. Why'd you say that?
Well, because it is both. If you look at it, Kyoto is going to be very expensive, and which is why a lot of countries, U.S. and Australia has formally not signed up to it, but as you also mentioned, Canada and several other countries, Japan, many of the southern European countries, even my own country, Denmark, are going to have a hard time actually living up to it. But even if we all did, at a fairly high cost of about 180 billion US dollars every year.
Where'd you get that number?
That's the average of all the macroeconomic models that have estimated the cost of Kyoto. It varies from somewhere between 50 billion and 500 billion dollars. So the average is about 180 billion dollars. The point here is to say that cost will gain us very, very little. If we just do the Kyoto Protocol for the 5 years that it's intended, it will postpone global warming by 7 days at the end of the century. Even if we continue for the rest of the century, which will be harder and harder for us, it will still only buy us about 5 years at the end of the century. And that's why I'm saying it's impossibly ambitious, because we are having a hard time actually living up to it. And yet, even if we did, it would be virtually inconsequential environmentally, which of course is why we need to start thinking about, are there better ways to deal with this problem?
We're going to get to those solutions in a moment, but I do want to follow up on one thing. Some people have observed that one of the good things about the approach that Al Gore is trying to take, essentially getting the world to act collectively towards a goal that we all agree on, is that it gives our lives purpose. It is a kind of a generational clarion call to action for everybody who lives in the world at this time. That's a good thing, isn't it?
Well, I certainly love the fact that we have a clarion call and that we have a sense of purpose. But again, I would somehow question, don't we want not just to feel good about ourselves, but actually end up doing a lot of good at the end of the century? The real point is, of course, to say, if there are many other things that we could have done that would have done a lot better, wouldn't we want to have done those first? And to give you a sense of proportion, Al Gore seems to be saying, let's spend $180 billion a year on doing virtually no good 100 years from now. I would tend to say that's perhaps not the very best way that we could help the world. And to give you a sense of difference, the UN estimate that for less than half the amount of Kyoto, about $75 billion a year, we could solve all major basic problems. We could give clean drinking water, sanitation, basic health care, and education to every single human being on the planet right now.
Now this
and
is
so
a
my
few
question
times.
is, wouldn't we rather want that to be our generational mission? Wouldn't we rather want to know that our kids and grandkids were thanking us for having basically solved most of the world's big issues rather than done virtually nothing against climate change? Again, we should, in a perfect world, do all things, but at least if we don't, and clearly we haven't for the last 50 years, shouldn't we first do the things that would actually do an amazing amount of good?
Now, during the course of our conversation, you've said 3 or 4 times we could do all of this expense and make all of these efforts to fulfill what Kyoto tells us to do, and it would have virtually no effect over the next 100 years. Can you give me 2 or 3 examples of how you believe implementing Kyoto would, at the end of the day, achieve next to nothing? Because that's certainly not what we've been told by the pro-Kyoto forces.
Well, what the pro-Kyoto forces almost inevitably always say is, well, Kyoto's just the first step. We should go much, much further. But 2 things. First of all, Kyoto is a pretty big step, which is why it costs so much. And also, we haven't even done Kyoto. I mean, look at 1992 and the Rio Summit and the Earth Summit. We promised to cut our emissions as industrialized countries, to cut our emissions back to 1990 levels in 2000. We overshot that by 12%. And then in 1997, at the Kyoto Protocol, we promised, all right, we're going to cut it even below 1990 levels by 2010.
Okay, but Bjorn, I need you to give me a couple examples, though, of things that you think are examples of how, even if we did Kyoto, it really wouldn't help us all that much.
Well, the basic problem is that if we do Kyoto, if we cut emissions, it's going to cut it in the Western world, but that, because it's a very small part of the total emissions, it's going to do next to nothing. That's what the climate models is telling us. If we do the Kyoto Protocol for the 5 years, it's going to postpone global warming by 7 days. If we do it till the end of the century, it's going to postpone global warming by 5 years. It's not about the individual ton, but it's just simply about the fact that because we're a fairly small part of the world, and because Kyoto only asked for a smaller reduction, we're not going to actually end up doing very much at the end of the century.
Okay, let me look at the other side of the Kyoto coin then. And again, the pro-Kyoto side says, in addition to the good things of reducing CO2 emissions, which I think everybody agrees would be a good thing to do, if we move forward on Kyoto, we will also spur on new kinds of environmental technologies that will create all kinds of wealth, replace all the jobs we may lose with these dying smoky industries, and this too will be a good thing. Do you have any reason to disbelieve that?
Well, I mean, first of all, of course we're going to create new jobs. If we ask people to make windmills, that will create jobs for windmills. But likewise, if we ask people to dig holes in the ground and fill them up again, that's going to create jobs in digging holes and filling them up. It's not about how you create jobs. It's about what kind of jobs you actually create, whether they create real wealth or just create sort of a job incentive structure. And at the end of the day, this is much more about making sure that we create new technologies that can take over. That part they're right about. But Kyoto doesn't do that. And that's the terrible truth about Kyoto. Kyoto is a short-term tactical approach that makes people think in accounting and how they can just get by over the next couple of years. But what we really require is to have a sense of how do we get through the 21st century and stop emitting by, say, 2050. We only do that by investing lots more in research and development. Now, a lot of people will say, but if we pay a lot, for instance, for more wind energy, we will also see a little increase in the research and development. That's technically true, but we're just not seeing it. And of course, if we actually want research and development, we should be spending our money directly on that. And that's, of course, what I propose in my book. Instead of focusing on cutting emissions now, which makes us feel good, but actually have very little or no impact, we should focus on making future cuts in carbon emissions much cheaper. We should focus on research and development to make sure that the next generations can cut emissions much cheaper. And let me give you a picture of this in a sense. Right now, solar cells cost about 10 times as much as fossil fuels. It means rich people in rich countries will put up a few to show how good they are. But poor people in rich countries won't, and certainly nobody in the poor countries will. What we need to make sure is, instead of just urging people to put up, please, a few more solar panels, which again is going to do very little good at very high cost, let's focus on research and development to make solar panels much, much cheaper so that by 2050, everybody in the rich countries will put up solar panels and everybody in the poor countries, simply because we've made it as cheap or perhaps even cheaper than fossil fuels is today.
Well, let me give you the devil's advocate other side of that story and then get you to comment on that. The devil's advocate side says, even if we go whole hog into this massive investment into new technologies, there's no guarantee at the end of the day that we're going to come up with something that, you know, never mind gets to zero emissions or is dramatically cleaner. There's no guarantee of that. However, if we reduce emissions today, we can take a tangible step today and for the ensuing century on reducing emissions, and that, I mean, that's a guarantee. We could do that now. Speak to that argument if you would.
Yeah, Stephen, you're absolutely right. There's no guarantee about the future, but the curious thing is that people will actually say, but we can guarantee if we cut, there will be a tangible effort. But I mean, we tried twice and we didn't do it very well. The Kyoto Protocol is going to cut emissions 0.7%, simply because people didn't live up to it. So yes, we have lots of people promising all kinds of things, but that doesn't mean it's going to happen. We didn't do it with Kyoto. We didn't do it in the Rio Summit. Saying, all right, we failed twice, let's go for a much more ambitious treaty down the same lines, seems fairly folly to me, and to believe that that's actually going to cause real cuts seem very, very unlikely. So we're all talking about how we deal with the future. I'm simply saying, instead of going down a future which we have tried twice and didn't work very well, maybe we should go down another way that is both going to be cheaper, it's going to be smarter, it has more chance of success. And no, at the end of the day, I can't promise you success, but I can tell you it has a hell of a lot more chance to actually work, to get everybody fired up, and actually help solve the problem by 2050.
Have we not cut back on emissions because we can't, or we just don't want to?
Well, it's a little of both. It's very hard to do so. I mean, we have constantly, throughout the last 200 years, cut our carbon emissions about 1% per year, simply because we get smarter. So what we're trying to do is to push our smartness. And that turns out to be fairly hard. And if you don't push smartness, basically you'll have to start cutting stuff that's really nice for you. Fossil fuels make a lot of things happen that we really like. So the problem here is, unless we get smarter, unless we find better ways to deal with this problem, we're not going to get much further down this road. And that's why I'm saying invest in research and development. Make sure that we unleash all that ingenuity that's gotten humanity through all the other problems throughout the many centuries that we've had of many problems we've had to fix. Let's make sure that we actually end up doing much more good. And that really only comes if we come up with cheap technologies. And let's also remember, we might be able to talk Canada, Denmark, maybe even the US into doing something about this, just simply because we're so rich. But we're never going to talk the Chinas and Indias of this world in, and they're going to be the major emitters throughout the 21st century. We have to make sure we give them technology that's going to be much cheaper. If we do, they'll do it. If we don't, we won't have a chance.
You mentioned Canada in that response, and let me follow up there. The Prime Minister of this country, of course, has recently expressed some support for a plan to cut global emissions in half by 2050. Yeah. As you know, he's not in favor of the Kyoto Protocol. Is this a better plan than Kyoto, do you think?
Well, it's curious. Everybody wants to promise, you know, the British government promised to cut 60% by 2050. Everybody has plans. We should notice that this is probably not only when the politicians are not any longer in office, they're probably going to be dead too. And so it's a very easy promise to make. It's a much harder promise to make sure that your predecessors will actually live up to. And the problem here is, look at what happened in Britain. Tony Blair wanted to cut by 60% by 2050. Then his backbenchers said, but wait a minute, why don't we just write in the legislation that that means we cut 3% every year? The British government panicked, because suddenly it would mean that next year you'd actually have to start living up to this promise. And of course, they had no intention of doing that. And so the point is, these are nice gestures, but they're just not going to get the work done. And as I've pointed out several times, we tried this before, and it just is very, very hard to do. And so we need to get back to reality. We need to get a sense of what can we actually do. And that's why I'm saying we need to cool the debate. That's what the book is about. It's not a hoax. It's not a catastrophe. It's a problem that we need to fix. There are many other problems like HIV/AIDS and malnutrition and malaria and all those things that we also need to fix, and I think should be our top priorities. But we also need to fix climate change, but the only way we're going to do it is through research and development.
I want to ask you about one of the fascinating arguments you made in your book, which was, yes, I think there are a lot of people out there today who are terrified at the notion that the Earth is heating up and that we're going to, particularly in places like Canada, you know, we're not going to have the harsh winters that we had anymore. People are going to start to die from the heat. You took us to the other side of the equation in your book, which is to say that may be true, but a lot of people aren't going to freeze to death either. Are we forgetting the other side of the argument?
We are very much, and of course that's a big part of my book, is just simply to get people to realize that the argument that we're very often presented with, namely that global warming is bad for good things and good for bad things, is a morality tale. It's not how the real world works. Of course global warming is both going to be positive and negative. It is overall going to be more negative than it's positive. That's why it's a problem. That's not why we need to fix it. But we need to understand that it's not just unmitigated catastrophe. Yes, with increasing temperatures, we're going to see more heat death. But with increasing temperatures, we're also going to see fewer cold waves, therefore fewer cold deaths. And since cold deaths in virtually all parts of the world vastly outweigh heat deaths, we're likely to see many fewer cold deaths. For Britain, where we have the best studies, it's estimated by 2050 there'll be 2,000 more people dying from heat waves every year on average. 2,000 people, that's important to say. But we also need to realize that there's going to be about 20,000 fewer people dying from cold waves. Globally, this also holds true. There's going to be about 400,000 more people dying from heat, but there's going to be 1.8 million people fewer dying from cold by 2050. We need to know these kinds of numbers, and what they tell us is that yes, while climate change overall will be a problem, it's not going to be the catastrophe that we are very one-sidedly being told, and which is, quite frankly, unlikely to lead to good policy judgment.
Bjorn, I want to read you a very cute quotation, if I could, from August 29th of this year from Salon.com, and it goes like this. NOAA has just gotten word about an upcoming episode of abrupt climate change, and he and his family are hard at work building an ark. I hear you laughing. You've heard this before, I'm guessing.
I've read it, yes.
Up walks a man, introduces himself as an adjunct professor at the Copenhagen Business School. I gather that's you. He says, NOAA, you have to stop. We've run the numbers and they don't add up. I agree that there may be a few days of rain, but if you really want to help future generations, don't build the ark, grow the economy. Okay, your response?
Well, I mean, it's a setup, right? If you say no, because we know the end of that story, and then obviously it was a stupid advice. But we don't know the end of the story that humanity is writing right now. But we do have very good models. I'm simply saying that a lot of the alarmists, a lot of the people who are saying we should make rapid action right now, are actually people who are very, very well-intentioned, but end up telling us we should make policies that end up doing fairly little good for people far out into the future, whereas we really could do a lot more right now. And for instance, when we talk about sea level rise, of course, the real problem here is to make sure that you zone land, that you make sure you build better sea level defenses. Look at New Orleans possibly as the best example. If you talk about New Orleans, would the best thing that we could have done for New Orleans in the 1990s, would that have been to say, we need to do the Kyoto Protocol? Or would it perhaps have been to say, we need to make sure you have better sea defenses and the wetlands in front of your city is better maintained? Of course, it would have been the latter. And that's the difference in approach. A lot of people just simply say, any question you come up with has to have the answer, cut carbon emissions. I simply say, well, sometimes that's going to be the best answer, but sometimes, obviously, it's not going to be. And it actually turns out for a lot of the things that people talk about with climate change, it's simply not the best answer. Let me give you one more example from malaria, which is to the third world. And a lot of people point out malaria is going to get worse in third world countries because of climate change. That's true. It's probably going to increase malaria by about 3% at the end of the century. If we do the Kyoto Protocol, we can avoid 0.2% extra malaria by the end of the century. That sounds like a good thing. But of course, I wonder why it is that people care so much about avoiding 0.2% at the end of the century and care so fairly little about the fact that there's 100% malaria right now that we could do something about easily. To put the numbers right in front of you, for every person that we can save from malaria through climate change policies, had we spent the same amount of money on actually helping people with malaria, we could have saved 36,000 people. I would certainly rather be the guy who helped save 36,000 people than just one person. That's what I want to be able to tell my kids and grandkids.
In our last minute here, let me ask you about this, and I wonder if this isn't somewhat of an explanation for what you just referred to. Some evolutionary psychologists have suggested that the concern over climate change is an example of the human species' need to fear something. Do you think that is a helpful explanation to all of this?
I don't know. I'm not a social psychologist, but I think we are the guys who evolved because we worried about the saber-toothed tiger, and not the guy who said, oh, it's probably going to be fine. So we're species that worry. I just simply want to make sure we worry about the right thing. There are lots of things out there that we can do something about. Let's, for God's sake, make sure that we are actually the generation who did a lot of good at a lot of the different things we could do something about, like HIV/AIDS, malaria, malnutrition, and also the guys who did smart things about climate change, invest in research and development. That way we can be proud and tell our future generations we actually did the best we possibly could.
The name of the book is Cool It. Bjorn Lomborg's been our guest. Thanks so much for joining us on the line from Los Angeles, Bjorn. Good to talk to you.